some, at least, magicians claim to be able to control nature, that they could bring down the moon from the sky, that they could cause an eclipse, that they could cause it to rain or not to rain. About the kinds of things that we find in, say, in Jewish writings, anybody would have classified as magic outside of Judaism. Jesus does things like, he's playing in the mud and making these like pigeons, and Mama comes out and says, "Jesus, you're getting dirty." And so he claps his hands and makes the birds fly away to dispose of the evidence. He gets mad at one of his playmates and curses him. He dies, and then he raises him back to life.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Are you ready for the magic show? Because I am. Today, Dr. Christopher Stanley is joining me today. Christopher D. Stanley, thank you again for joining us here at MythVision.
Happy to be with you, Derek.
I'm happy too. I thought maybe he's bringing a clown outfit or he's going to do some David Blaine tricks in front of us. I don't know. I never know. So, ladies and gentlemen, go check out his books. As Slave's Story is a trilogy right now. You can also go to the link in the description on Amazon to find these books, or go to the website that's in the description, as well as get his other books on Paul. We're going to be dealing with that in our next episode, where we're actually taking a deeper dive into Paul's literature and what is he saying, what's going on with this guy, and what is he trying to tell us, or at least tell the people he's writing to, and we're reading these letters. So I hope you go and check out his work. He also has that on Audible, so you can listen to A Slave Story, which is cram-packed with actual, factual, historical data. So it's not like it's just a fictional story. Like, actual scholars have looked at it and said, hold on, this is actually very close, if not identical, to what it would have looked like. And when he doesn't have absolute facts, because history is probability, he kind of fills in those gaps, and a lot of the scholars are going, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense, and I can go with the flow. So if you really want to look into our past and you're someone like me who wants to understand history, this is a book I think is really worth diving into. So please go check out the trilogy, the series. You're just now waiting on the third one to be published, and so we can have all three and have fun.
Actually, I haven't started writing the third one yet. That's my project for this year. So
okay, so what was the book you just sent off?
Yeah, the one that I just sent off was the academic book on Paul and Asclepius, the Greco-Roman quest for healing. And that's where I've got a lot of the material that we'll be talking about today about magic in the ancient world. I was mentioning earlier that when I was writing the novels, I didn't know as much about the magic side as I do now, as I worked out in the last year in writing this other more academic book. And so while there are some elements in these novels of the things we'll talk about today, the more in-depth treatment of this, we'll have to wait till, I think my book is supposed to come out in September from Bloomsbury, T&T Clark, in the Library of New Testament series. This is again, Paul and Asclepius, the Greco-Roman quest for healing and the mission of Paul.
Wow. Go get it, because we've done an episode teasing you on all that as well. And I'm looking forward to reading that literature. Also, consider joining the Patreon for MythVision. You'll be seeing this first there. Thank you for those who help support us and keeping us alive and doing what we're doing. I've got a lot of interviews that have not made it to the public yet that are out there, and I really appreciate the support. Now, let's talk about magic. I guess the best way to start this is, Dr. Stanley, what is it? I mean, when we think of magic, we think of David Blaine. We think of these tricksters or sleight of hand, and they're literally paid actors to do the very thing. They want you to think what they did is real, but usually there's some stunt or something, and it entertains us. What is magic in the ancient world?
Yeah, there certainly were people in the ancient world who did the kind of tricks, kind of public performance entertainment shows of the type that you might find with, David Blaine or David Copperfield or whoever. In fact, one of the things that I learned recently, didn't know, is that the old balls under the cups deal goes actually back to our earliest evidence of that. It goes back to around the time of Jesus in Rome. So it's interesting to see. It may be older than that, depending on how you interpret a particular painting from ancient Egypt and a tomb there. But yeah, people were doing things like that, and we can say some later about maybe what some of those things were. But the term magic, as it's used in the ancient world, really doesn't particularly relate so much to those things as it does to a form of practice that was seeking to manipulate supernatural powers to benefit individuals in the ancient world. So, by our modern terms, magic, or the Greek word magia, was in a sense a form of religion. Today we would, try to draw fine lines between what's religion and what's magic. And for example, when you have, New Age healers with crystals or whatever. Well, is that religion or is that magic or is it something else? But in the ancient world, very much at the core of the idea here is engaging with supernatural powers. Magic had a bad name in the ancient world, according to our authors, who are elite urban males, whose power and authority is being threatened by these more popular expressions of religion that go by the name of magia. Our word magic actually comes from this Greek word magia. Let me say a quick word about the history of the concept, and then we can get into the actual practices, because it's important for understanding something about why basically the word magic or magia was kind of a smear term that was used by educated elites to refer to certain types of practices that they didn't like. It goes all the way back to the earliest use of this term is in the 6th, 5th century BC with the Persians. And they had these religious experts who traveled with them, giving oracles for, when the army should act or not, performing sacrifices and offerings, basically doing religious kinds of things. And the Persians were the great enemies of the Greeks. And most people may know something vaguely from their history about battles between the Greeks and the Persians, the Battle of Thermopylae, and might have seen the movie, some of the movies about that kind of thing. But to use a term that was associated with the Persians was kind of like in the 1950s and 60s calling somebody a commie. It was like taking a term that was popular out there that was associated with an enemy, and then just saying this, that, and the other. That's those commies, and that's those commie practices. And so magia derives from these priests were called magi, or we would say magi. And so the term magia, or the practitioner, is a magos, comes from this kind of a smear term from applied to the Persians. So when it was used by the Persians, it wasn't anything like what we know of as magic, but that came to be applied by the educated elites to practices they didn't like. In essence, if we go back to, and again, I'm not going to get you too much into detail here, but if we go back to Plato, Plato had two criticisms of the kinds of things that he and others like him despised. That one was they were working outside of the established civic cult. One of the big differences between the ancient world and our modern conception of religion is we think of religion as an individual phenomenon, my personal spirituality or something like that. That kind of view of religion was very uncommon in the ancient world. Religion was a matter of the people and their God. Some of your listeners may be familiar with with the idea in the Jewish scriptures or the Christian Old Testament of Yahweh having a covenant with the people of Israel, and how he deals with them as a whole, not so much as individuals. Mm-hmm. Well, the same was true in Greek and Roman world, where the local city or the empire, in the case of the Romans, would have a patron deity or deities. And basically kind of religion is expected to go through them. You need to pay due homage to that. And the local religious cult is run by civic officials. There's no such thing as a separation of church and state, of religion and politics in the ancient world. It's all very much intertwined. And so when you did have people who were kind of offering, in essence, what these people who came to be smeared as Magi were doing, is they're saying, we're going to work outside of the cult to address the needs of individuals. And we can do sacrifices and incantations and spells and all kinds of activities. We can talk about what some of those activities were in a minute to channel the power either of the gods that everybody believed in, or these kind of numinous powers, ill-defined supernatural entities to do good or harm for people. And that's one of the things, again, we can unpack in a minute, that Magia was basically like religion, about receiving benefits and avoiding harms. And so in ancient Greek and Roman religion, the essence of it was an exchange of benefits, which was really based in the way their societies worked. You had a hierarchical society where you had the patron, who was the rich guy who had benefits to supply. And then that person had clients who were attached to him and usually a him. And they would do services for him and he would provide benefits for them. And so the idea is this established system of exchanging benefits back and forth that keeps society working. And they said, oh, well, that's how it is with the gods too. And so we offer sacrifices and offerings to the gods because we want to have a good harvest, or because we want to get this epidemic to leave us, or whatever the case may be. Or
just to emphasize this for people who are thinking biblically, blessings and curses, okay?
Exactly.
And then also salvation in the Hebrew Bible carries a completely different connotation than what we find in the Greco-Roman world in the first century in Christianity. Yeah. So like the definition, you see the same word maybe being used, salvation. But like you talk about from harm, like there's physical, literal here in this world things that they're trying to be saved from. And I think that's also the difficulty with doing this podcast, is like sometimes the terms and ideas and this background that you're actually trying to build for our audience to understand where you're coming from. We're trying to like put the Bible for a second, or at least the New Testament, on the sidelines for 1 second while you build this up. Then we'll get to what maybe we're looking at in the New Testament. Because if they don't understand this, what are they thinking? David Blaine? Or are they thinking like, what are they thinking? They don't really know maybe with background. So
yeah, and even just to carry that a step further and anticipate a little bit, the idea, the word grace that's used in the New Testament, the Greek word charis, is very heavily embedded, and you don't often hear this in Christian circles. That is the primary term that's used in Greek for the benefits that the patron gives to the client. And then, Christians traditionally have had this theological problem of, well, if God's grace is so abundant toward us, then where do works fit in? Ancient Romans and Greeks would have had no problem with that, because when the patron does acts of charis for the clients are obligated to provide services to the patron. And if they don't do that, then they are violating the relationship. So it was just, everybody understood that grace on the part of the patron led to works on the part of the recipients.
You and just like destroyed so many Protestant sects just
So, this is all just assumed in there because everybody knew this.
Yeah.
And the same was true with regard to the gods. The gods do provide material benefits for humans, good crops, health, healthy children, etc. And then you provide back to them the sacrifices and offerings. And that was kind of the established cultist system.
And that seems common sense.
Exactly. But there were then these people who worked outside of that system. Who were, a woman named Heidi Wendt has written a great book called At the Temple Gates, where she classifies these people together with a very helpful term as freelance religious experts. There were people who claimed to have a certain kind of expertise that they could bring to the benefit of individuals, but they were freelance. That is, they worked outside of the established cultus that is the religious system associated with the authorities, the elites, the educated people. They manage this religious system. So in essence,
Unorthodox.
in essence, we might say that Magia is the religion of the masses. It's although that's a bit of an overgeneralization, because the elites also took advantage of some of these magi. I'm trying to avoid the word magician, because that brings to us, our minds, things like you said, like David Blaine and whatever.
Right.
Might be better to say magic workers or something like that. But even then, the terms are really difficult, because we've got all these modern connotations that just don't apply to the ancient world. So magia is the practice of what we would call magic, and the Magus is the one who actually is the practitioner, and magi or magi is the plural of that. So that's kind of a quickie nutshell that could be unpacked much more. I haven't said anything yet about what kinds of techniques they used, how they were similar to and different from the established religions. But fundamentally, this can at least get us oriented into the subject. And some of the things they did were very much like what other religious people did, offerings and sacrifices, etc. And some of the things they did were uniquely their own, that were novel developments. So let me pause for a moment and let you jump in here, Derek.
Yeah, no, it makes me really want to get into some of the examples in the broader world before we get into the biblical one on, what do we mean by magic? You're talking about manipulating spirits. You're talking about powers that be. And the interesting thing is we're going to be getting into the Judeo-Christian world. They did this too. In fact, their patron was Solomon, and he manipulated spirits too. Mm-hmm. They had no problem with this. Even though they were what we call monotheist, there were powers and spirits and stuff roaming everywhere. So, so there's this idea, and I know from the version of Christianity I came from, I thought things were filled with spirits all the time. In fact, I was so cautious about cussing because they called it cursing. And if you said a curse word, you might bring curses on. Like, this is the kind of mindset that I had. And I imagine, if I was to be fair, that would be something of a sort that they
Exactly. I mean, curses and love potions. It wasn't, while my book, I focused particularly on the healing side of things, but we can get into, if you like, also some of the other things in terms of the power of words. It was believed to able to be effective when they were spoken or written in all kinds of ways, kind of like something close to what we popular imagination calls voodoo dolls. That you would use to cause harm to other people, but also various rituals you could use to make somebody fall in love with you, or to succeed in your athletic contest, or to make more money. Again, as he's mentioned earlier, very material, this worldly benefits and gains. Maybe, and just to pick up on the analogy I said earlier to the social system. The normal operation of the system would be the patron gives and clients respond. And that would be akin to the civic cultus. But just, you can also imagine the client who says, watch what I can do to get this patron to do what I want, and would learn how to manipulate the patron by certain actions, certain kinds of words, certain ways of buttering up, etc. And in a way, that would be magia. This is manipulating the powers outside without working through the normal system.
I bet it'd be very difficult to really completely understand, being as far removed as we are, to really completely understand what their mind was thinking and how they were doing this. But you're getting me closer to wanting to get into those details. So we know there's curses, there's love, there's potions. Let me win this race. Help me find my car keys. I'm just, using an example.
I'll give you some examples of the kinds of things that would fit in the category of magia. When it comes to healing, there were certain, as in every culture, there were plants that people used, animal substances, a host of things like this, very much part of Greek and Roman traditional medicine. But there were ways that professional magicians and magical healers had, in a sense, enhancing those powers, and they would do things like, they believed that certain plants had spirits associated with them that gave them great power, and you had to know the right rituals to use in picking that plant, or it could harm you, or it could harm other people. And so things like, so many different things. When you would go out to pick it, you might need to pick it at night, and it might need to be a full moon. You might need to be naked when you do it. Draw circles around it with a particular metal implement. Pick it a certain way. Maybe put offerings into the ground to that spirit in the hole that you pulled the plant out of. Maybe hold it up above you, or do something with it. And all these different kind of rituals are meant to contain and control the power that they believed resided in the plant, so that then when a drug seller who also could do things with incantations and spells to give them more power, by the time that medicine reaches the public market, it is imbued, they believe, with all this supernatural power that would then, by taking this, you're not just taking something that has chemical properties. You're taking something that has the essence of the divine in that particular plant.
This makes me so badly wish I could find the origin of when men, and maybe women, because women probably did this.
Oh, women did this as well.
Yeah, it makes me really want to, like, anthropologically, if I could go back in our history as humans, like, what dots did we connect to think that that's what it did? You see what I'm trying to get at? Like, I'll give you an analogy, and then just to kind of get you where I'm coming from. Way back before writing, a lot of scholars talk about how we were oral and not written, so we didn't know how to compartmentalize things the same way. And what that means is, like, we know how to think about a subject because we're writing, we're literary, and we put it in our brain in a certain shelf, and we can start separating things. As oral people, we connected dots that may not have connected. As an example, every year during spring, like it's about to be spring here soon, the star Venus would rise. And they would always connect and say, that star brought the power of life. It is divine. It has the power to bring life. And like today, maybe modern science might say, like, well, Venus is, this is what stars do. And every year is a coincidence that, Venus comes up when it's springtime. And here we have, agriculture starting to grow, et cetera, et cetera. But in the ancient world, those dots connected. It makes me wonder what made them think, if I'm naked and if I go here and I draw this circle and there's a spirit in that plant, what connection, like when did that start and how?
So one of the things that's so hard for us to imagine ourselves into the ancient world and into the past, not just Greeks and Romans, but elsewhere too, is that we are so much the products of the Enlightenment in the 17th century, et cetera, where we essentially divorced the divine from the natural world. And even prior to that, of course, Christianity and Judaism and Islam see God as both, involved in this world, but also kind of above it.
Right.
But throughout most of human history, it's just hard to us to imagine how frail and helpless humans were in the face of the forces of nature. And when you get your living off of agriculture or hunting, you are very much at the mercy of these natural forces, which you don't understand. And so as far back as humans are, as we know anything about human thought and practice, there seems to have been an attribution of all these unexplained and uncontrollable things as some kind of, we might use the word divine or supernatural. Those are problematic terms because supernatural implies that there is a category of nature, and then there's something above and outside of that. But throughout much of human history, the spirits, the whatever you want to call them, were seen as being immanent in this world and even localized in certain places. So even with the Greeks and Romans, you can have a nymph or a dryad who, lives in this pond or in this tree or whatever the case may be. And anything that seemed kind of scary in some way would be associated with gods and powers. And the Romans just saw gods and spirits everywhere, thousands of gods, much like in India today, where they say there are like 3 million gods or something like that. And so, to situate yourself in a world where the divine or the spirits are everywhere, you live surrounded by them, as you said earlier. And so then if you take that as your starting point, then it becomes just totally natural. You want to say, okay, how do I get these powers to help me and not harm me? Because again, these powers aren't necessarily good. They're not necessarily favorably disposed to human beings. And so you want to be able to channel the ones that want to help you and have got the most power to benefit you. And you want to do things to keep away the others. And so rituals are the primary means by which that's done. And so I mentioned some of the rituals around planting. Chants and spells and incantations played a very important role in the activity of these Magia workers. I'll give you some examples of them in a moment, but words were seen as having power, that words can affect the supernatural and make it do things. Cursing also would be part of that curses, the spoken curses, written curses, were believed to actually affect what you wanted them to carry out. The same thing with, imbuing substances such that you could make a potion or an amulet or something could be put under a woman's pillow or poured into her drink to make her fall in love with you.
Or get pregnant too, right? Like you.
Oh yeah, exactly. All kinds of practice, or to aid the delivery of a child. The midwives used various kinds of what we would call magical practices around childbirth to try to ensure a smooth and healthy childbirth. Children, special amulets were put on children. Everybody in the ancient world, as I mentioned earlier, wore amulets. Some kind of it might just be some plant substances or animal substances that were seen as having healing properties. But the ones that were given by these magic workers would be empowered with chants and incantations. And they might be prepared out of certain substances that were thought to have special power. If it was something like a ring or a gem, it might be carved with images of a god or a spirit. Let's say, for example, one popular one would have a god on a horse with a spear impaling a demon. And by wearing that, you are kind of scaring away the demons, if you will. So all these kinds of things to avert jealousy. Oh, and one thing I haven't mentioned, the evil eye. I mean, everybody believed in the evil eye. What's the evil eye? When somebody looks at you like that?
Yeah.
That was genuinely believed, everybody believed at all levels in society that could actually harm other people. And, you think about, we have this modern scientific understanding about eyes. Okay, how do the eyes work? Well, the iris open, the pupil opens and light comes in. No. That's not how vision works. Not in the ancient world.
Yeah.
I mean, there are different ideas about how vision works, but the most common idea is eyes emit rays. They emit fire, a certain kind of fire or light or something that goes out and hits other things or people or whatever. And then in some way, different ideas about how it reflects back or merges with the fire in the air or something like that. And so they believe that people literally emitted rays in their eyes. And so you can see it's only one step from that to say, when I look at you in that mean, glaring way, I am actually sending harmful power into you. And so people had various rituals that they would use to try to avert that. I mean, that to hold your finger like this is called the fig gesture. Was a way of averting the evil eye or averting evil powers. Spitting, if somebody looked at you with the evil eye, spitting on the ground could avert the evil eye. And there's actually a passage in Paul where that's probably what the background of what he's saying. So, it is such a completely different world than anything. And one other last thing, exorcisms. And now Greeks and Romans probably got the idea of exorcism from Jews. It's not a Christian phenomenon. Christians got it from Jews as well. Jews were well known as exorcists in the ancient world, as also as well known as magicians. But certainly in a lesser way, everybody believed in evil spirits, and there are various rituals you could use to drive away evil spirits who were not so much seen as possessing people, but troubling and annoying and attacking people. And so there are a lot of what's called apotropaic rituals that you could engage in, things to scare away or drive away the evil spirits that might be causing harm. So these are just a smattering of the kinds of things that will fit in the category of magic in the ancient world, the kind of things that people claim to have expertise in. And I also have to add one more thing. Some, at least, magicians claim to be able to control nature, that they could bring down the moon from the sky, that they could cause an eclipse, that they could cause it to rain or not to rain. Even that they could fly. So now we're into like another realm entirely. People who are claiming to have these supernatural powers, and of course healings come in there as well. The ability to heal people. I was going to use our word, instantly, miraculously, supernaturally, whatever you want to go. So where do you want to go with this, Derek?
Yeah. So I look, on our previous episode, you talked about how a lot of these things overlap. Like healing is not just a magic thing, but also has it's what we like to call medicinal side of things. And oftentimes they overlap. So I don't want to go there. What I would like to do is maybe now that we have a background knowledge to some degree on how people thought, and I mean, we're scratching this. I can't imagine you, even with all you're probably like, it gets pretty wild. I'm not sure. So my question is, how can we bring this into New Testament studies pertaining to Paul probably first, because it's a little difficult with him. There's not as much narration going on. It's more like these are real letters written to real people. And it's not so much like narrated like Acts or the Gospels. So maybe we deal with Paul on magic and what that means, since we talked about him not being technically a miracle worker, maybe because it didn't work for him. Who knows what the reason is? You're very open-minded. That's what I love about you the most. And then we'll get into like where we know they're talking about him being a magician, or like they're claiming, obviously derogatory wise, he cast out Beelzebub with Beelzebub, and like all of these weird phenomena, the guy cutting himself that's in the gospel, things like this. What's going on here? And then maybe we can even be a little critical. I'd love to get your thoughts on Jesus the magician and why he, the author, has caused people to kind of not even be interested in investigating it anymore. Maybe give us pros and cons to what is brought by Morton Smith.
Yeah, there are a few practices. Well, even if you go back to prior to Paul, it might be worth noting that Paul was a Jew, and he was looking at the Jewish scriptures as his foundation. And probably some of us, when we hear about magic, will think, well, of course, Jews didn't do those things, because there are these verses in the Old Testament that, condemn the performance of, sorcery, and witches are to be burned and or executed and things like this. But interestingly, those passages, they're very vague. They don't explain what they mean. And none of them, as far as my particular interest, none of them relate to healing. And so there develops this tradition in Judaism that if something brings about healing, it has to be okay. But even in the Old Testament, you find people doing things that certainly look to us to be magical types of practices. We've got the story of using mandrakes with Rachel and Leah to be able to get pregnant. There is a story of Isaiah healing Hezekiah by putting a particular substance on him that doesn't seem to have medicinal value. There's Naaman to go bathe in the Jordan River that doesn't really seem very medicinal as well. And we could go on and on, lots of other examples. Some things that even are manipulating sacred objects to access divine power, like this situation where a man is falsely accused or is accusing his wife of adultery, and so she has to go through this ritual where they do this scroll and they burn it, and then she's got to drink the ashes with it, and if she dies, well, she was guilty. Or you get consulting the Urim and Thummim for divination, casting lots. A lot of things that we would define as magical are there in the Bible itself. Not to mention Jesus. So I say that as a bit of a background for Paul, that we can't necessarily presume just because he was a Jew he would have had any problem with any of these kind of things.
Right.
In Paul's case, there aren't many references that would fit what we would think of as magic, but there are a few. The most, probably the best known one would be in 1 Corinthians 5, where he talks about this guy who is engaged in adultery or has sex with his father's wife or whatever, perhaps his stepmother. And he says in 1 Corinthians 5, beginning with verse 3, for though absent in body, magicians claim to be able to leave their bodies, astral projection, we might say today. I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment in the name of the Lord Jesus on the man who has done such a thing. When you are assembled and my spirit is present with the power of the Lord Jesus, we need to take that in a very literal kind of a way, that he believes his spirit can be present at a distance like this. You are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. So kind of a cursing. And he also uses curse language in Galatians 1, where he says, if anybody preaches to you a gospel other than I have, let him be accursed. Actually, that's a tone down of it. In Greek, he says, let him be damned. God damn those people.
Wow.
Who are preaching something contrary to what I do. And at the end of 1 Corinthians in 16, there's this word Maranatha. If someone is not acknowledging Jesus, let him be cursed.
That's in 1 Corinthians 13?
1 Corinthians 16, the very end. Let anyone be accursed who has no love for the Lord. Come, our Lord. Maranatha is to come, our Lord. But if they don't have no love for the Lord, let him be accursed. He literally means cursing, and the curses have power. He's not just saying, well, God one day condemned that person to hell or something like that. A less clear passage in Galatians 3, Paul says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? This is a standard language. The Greek word he uses here has to do with casting a spell. He's using the idea that somebody has cast a spell on you. And he talks about, there are these few references in Paul. But again, I think Paul, you could even, once you've got those things, then one can also see other things in Paul that at least could have been seen by outsiders as having magical quality. This weird language in 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's 29, about the Corinthians who are being baptized for the dead. there were actually, again, in magical circles, the idea that you could do certain things that would affect the fate of the dead in Hades. And of course, later on, we have ideas of Catholics and purgatory and what you can do in this world to affect their fate. It's hard to know what's going on with that language, but it certainly sounds kind of magical. Jesus, the very language about a spirit dwelling in oneself, a spirit of a dead man dwelling in one, would have sounded magical to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
You
so
know, if I may,
just things that might have caused people to look at Paul as a magician. And of course, as I said in our last broadcast, that even though Paul is a miracle worker himself, he does claim that acts of power of some type occurred in conjunction with his preaching. Was that healings and exorcisms? Was it something else we don't know? But Paul certainly was, there were elements of what Paul was saying and doing that could well have made him look like one of these magic workers in the eyes of at least some people.
Two things just to bring up to get your thoughts on. Baptism of the dead is obviously one, even Christians today, like, what? But baptism, period. And
Right.
then that was what I was going to ask you. There seems to be some magic there going on because your water supposed to wash away something. You're a renewed person. Are you buried with Christ? This seems like the traditional water washing that you would expect a normal Jew. There's like a special version of it for Christianity and being buried with Christ and stuff. There's something very strange. Even Christians today, though, recognize it as I'm buried, especially immersed versions where there's people who argue, is it sprinkling? Is it this? There's all sorts of that in the Greek. Is it the baptizo? Whatever the particular term might mean. The point is, you're going down, you're coming up. It's like being buried and resurrecting with Jesus. And the second thing I wanted to say was, isn't sacrifice period magical? Because the idea that this animal's blood will cause somehow either good things for you or remove your sins, different things might be the case, but the animal's blood magically does something for us. So baptism and sacrifice, if you could comment on those just real quick.
Yeah, what you're getting at is kind of something I said earlier. You really can't draw a line in terms of the practices between religion and magic in the ancient world. They did a lot of the same kind of things, even spells and incantations and the power of words. I mentioned, I think, in our last conversation that in Roman public rituals, and this is like the civic ritual, you had to say all the words exactly right for the ritual to have effect. And if the priest screwed up on any word or gesture or something, they had to start all over because it would not have the power. So yes, religion itself in the Greek and Roman world was very much about using rituals to interact with the divine realm. And so the difference is not so much along those lines. The difference is, is the person part of the civic cult, or are they a freelance expert who's going off and kind of doing things on their own for ordinary people? And B, are they doing any of these other they would have viewed it as weird kinds of practices that were not part of the civic cult. So those, and again, when I use the word cult here, I should clarify for your audience, this is a term that scholars use for ritualized worship. So it's not a cult in the sense that we use the word today, a weird little group or something like that. So when Christians come together and take the Lord's Supper, that would also be called by religious scholars a Christian cult or cultus. So I'm using the term civic cult in that sense, not in the sense of some odd little group with weird practices and expecting the end of the world to come soon or something like that.
I have a funny clip just to show you when you said the priest in particular. If they get the words wrong, I actually made this the other day. I'll just play the intro to show you.
Okay.
Ooh, wait a minute. The words. Right. Say the words. Klaatu, Narada. Hey,
Anyway, I just thought it was funny because it's right in the vein of, like, if you ever seen Army of Darkness, that's the name of it. It's a classic. It's hilarious. He's like told these 3 words by this magician. I don't know if it's Merlin or who the guy is. And he's like, you must remember these words. He's like, I got it, man. I got it. Then he gets to the end and he's like, he couldn't remember. So he's like, Plato, Rata. And then the dead actually hear him mess up the last word. So it fits exactly what you're saying.
While we're on that, I can't resist this. I mentioned to you earlier that the word abracadabra actually comes from ancient Greek magic. And there are some documents called the PGM, Papyri Graiki Magiki, or the Greek magical papyri, that we have that contain all kinds of these spells, etc. They date from around the 2nd century BC to maybe the 4th or 5th century AD. I'll just give you just some examples of some of these things. Here's how you can become invisible. It says, a tested spell for invisibility, a great work. Take an eye of an ape or of a corpse that has died a violent death and a plant of peony. Rub these with oil of lily, and as you're rubbing them from the right to the left, say the following spell. I am Anubis, I am Osirfre, I am Osat Saranuriye, I am Osiris whom Seth destroyed. Rise up, infernal demon. Eo Erbeth, Eo Phobeth, Ta Pekarbeth, Eo Apamps. Whatever I order you to do, be obedient to me. And if you wish to become invisible, rub just your face with the concoction and you will be invisible for as long as you wish. And if you wish to be visible again, move from west to east and say this name and you will be obvious invisible to all men. Just randomly, I'll read you a couple of others just to give you samples. Let's see, let me find one here. Some of them are really, really long, and you got these drawings, things you're supposed to do, and all kinds of rituals. Here's calling a god. Come hither to me, you who are in control of the form of Helios, the sun god. You, the cat-faced god, and behold your form being mistreated by your opponents, so that you may revenge yourself upon them and accomplish the deed. And I'm calling the spirit, conjuring you by your names. Barbathiao Mayan Sha'o Nai Baharab. I mean, I can't even pronounce these things, but by reciting these, what we would call, nonsense syllables, these are actually seen as having power to affect the supernatural realm and to bind the evil spirit, the good spirits, to help you, or to bind the evil spirits away. These things are here for cursing, for healing, for love potions, for success. It just goes on and on and
if
on.
If I may,
on.
This begs me to ask you.
Yeah,
I used to speak in tongues. Okay, I used to be like filled with the Spirit. You speak in tongues, and I'm not knocking it. I get why. And there's some satisfaction even when you're singing in tongues at church and things like that. People on the outside go, what a weirdo. But either way, Paul spoke in tongues more than everybody. He mentions in one passage, way better than me, but he talks about speaking in tongues build your faith. Right. Is this magical? Does he think that the words of the tongues of angels, this idea that it's angelic speech, almost like what we see with Sibylline oracles and stuff like that, is this something magical, you think?
I don't think I would put that in that category for this reason, that Paul describes that as a form of prayer in 1 Corinthians 14. And as you say, a way of kind of communing with God and nurturing your own inner spirit. You're not trying to recite magical phrases to bring supernatural powers under your control. So I don't think I would put that. It's closer to what actually, where we have examples of things like speaking in tongues outside of Christian circles, it's usually more accompanied with oracles and prophecy. And it's no accident that those two are linked also in Paul. Dale Martin, who we talked about earlier, wrote a great article a number of years ago, and I don't have the reference, but I remember it has glossolalia in the title. And he deals with, brings out all these examples from other sources that have to do with things like speaking in tongues. So that might be a place to look. Dale B. Martin, and if you look up with glossolalia, probably pops up online somewhere. It's an academic article, but it's very good at pulling together all these data.
Okay, we did Paul. And Paul we could go more exhaustive, but we don't have all day. So shifting into the literature that critical scholars would say, okay, Paul is our best material that we can trust is actually real, like what is actually going on, instead of possibly being literary, which means, is this what's really going on? Is this what really happened? Either way, let's just grant reading these that this is what happened, or this is what was happening. Acts is a little later, Gospels are a little earlier, it seems. What's going on in here? Jesus is seen as a magician. It's usually in a derogatory term. And while we get into Jesus and Acts of the Apostles, I want to make one mention that I think is interesting in the law of the Tanakh. And the idea is to not do witches and magic, or it seems like it's like this condemnation of incantations and this and this and that. This seems like if you're doing things outside what we say is acceptable, you're in trouble. So you need to follow our practices. And doesn't mean they didn't believe in these weird ideas that we think are weird today, but that they were saying don't do those things. So here's Jesus. He's doing things according to the Gospels, like casting out demons and healings, even things like that. How does that fit into this whole thing and the early church on magic?
Yeah, that's a kind of complicated one to try to answer, and I'll try to be somewhat brief on it. Back in 1978, Morton Smith wrote a book called Jesus the Magician. He was a scholar who was very quirky in a lot of his works, and he basically pulled in anything and everything could possibly be associated with defining Jesus as a magician. And virtually everyone who's come after him has said that he tended to distort a lot of the evidence, and it really kind of poisoned the well in some respects for academic discussions of Jesus as a magician until perhaps more recent times. I think that part of the problem with defining whether Jesus is a magician or not is that he doesn't fit he doesn't do many of the kinds of things that magicians did. If you look through the Gospels, the only examples of things that would be like what ancient magicians did for healing would be when he is putting mud on the guy's eyes, or spitting on the guy's eyes, or pronouncing words that seem to be nonsensical for him. Just a handful of instances like that. And then, of course, the exorcisms, in the sense that exorcism was a practice that was associated with magic workers and such as that. But it wasn't necessarily, because again, Jews were very well known as exorcists also. So it's hard to find much that there are elements that would be similar to magical practice, but there's a lot of things about him don't fit what we would typically think of. However, having said that, he still, the stories about him were read by ancient people who were not sympathetic to Christianity as, whoa, there's a magician. And we know that because Origen, in the 2nd century church father, is against Celsus. Celsus is this Greek critic of Christianity, and Celsus is describing Jesus as a magician, and Origen is having to say, well, no, he's not, and here's why. We know 4th century Augustine and Eusebius are still responding to charges by non-sympathetic Greeks or Romans that Jesus is a magician. And so having said what I said, the fact that we have clear evidence that people outside the Christian movement did look at these stories and say, hey, that's a magician. And they saw that as a bad thing. Because again, keep in mind that magia is a derogatory term when it appears in the writings of elite authors. You want to smear somebody, again, just like you wanted to call somebody a commie in the 50s or 60s, or the way that Republicans like to smear every Democrat as a socialist today.
Mhm.
So similar kind of thing. So
or vice versa, and calling them Nazis or whatever. Yeah, there's always
exactly.
If I can, just while we're on that, what you're saying here, if I was to try and like devil's advocate back in Acts, there's this place where they call Simon this magician, Simon Magus, and I'm sure you were going to get into this too. But my point isn't this is why I figured like sanctioned, acceptable acts of what outsiders would call magic are technically magic to people who are on the outside. But if you were on the inside, you wouldn't call it magic. You would just say, oh, no, that's normal. That's acceptable. That's good. So technically, could Jesus be a magician by standards of the ancient world, but not technically, if you were inside, you're not going to call him that. You wouldn't say that.
Yeah, and it's certainly, again, the categories are very vague. Interestingly, nobody in the Gospels ever calls him a magician. He's accused, as you mentioned earlier, of doing things by the power of Satan. But it's not a term that Jews would have used. Jews are described by other people as doing magia.
Right.
But the Jews themselves did not use that term. They didn't say, okay, I'm going to be a magical practitioner. Whereas Greeks and Romans did actually. This was something you were trained in. You could be trained for years in apprenticeship to a practicing magic worker. And they often had secret books, if they were able to read and write, that contained their spells and things like that. So in that sense, the kind of sociocultural reality of being a magus meant going through training to learn the arcane secrets of the particular kind of practice that you were engaging in, what kind of school or branch or type of magic you were performing. And so there's no evidence that Jews did that or that Jesus did that. And yet, does that mean they are not don't fit that category? As we say, outsiders would put them in that category. We could have a long conversation here about, and I could give you some brief examples if you wanted to, about the kinds of things that we find in, say, in Jewish writings that anybody would have classified as magic outside of Judaism, but Jews didn't, use that term to describe what they were doing. They didn't have a system of training. Neither did the early Christians, and yet they engaged in and continued the practices they'd engaged in prior to becoming Christ followers of wearing amulets, using spells and incantations, and a host of other kinds of things that were carried over from their pre-Christian days.
So getting into Acts, because this is going to take us a little later. I think Acts is dated later. I really put it in the 2nd century, just based on the scholars I've been hearing back and forth, at least after 93, because it seems he's aware of Josephus's writing, his final writing. So in Acts, you have this guy named Simon Magus who wants to, hey man, I'll pay you for that. Give me the Holy Spirit. And they're like, nah, you know what? Curse you, Peter says, or something. He damns him, and it's like, whoa,
makes him blind. Yeah,
here we go again with Paul, right? And this idea of like damning someone, but it even is a curse. And my question is, this guy Simon shows up even in second century literature. There's this conflict going on, and this guy plays some significant role in certain groups, it seems. Tell us more about Simon the magician, Simon the Magi, if you will, or Magus. Yeah. And how that works with early church.
Yeah, that's not something I'm too expert on, but I can say a little bit. He becomes, in later Christian tradition, the embodiment of these magical practices. When I say Christians were doing these magical actions, the reason we know that is that these literate, some of it we can get from archaeology, but mostly from the fact that these elite male Christian leaders are trying to get them to stop it. They're constantly, saying this is not right. And whenever you've got people criticizing, condemning something, it's happening. And so Simon becomes this, among the literati, he becomes a way of in some circles, a way of encapsulating this, personifying these practices that you should avoid. And there's a document called the Acts of Peter, where there's this competition between Peter and Simon in Rome to one-up each other on performing magical acts. And so Peter, of course, wins. And there are other texts too, the Pseudo-Clementines and others, where Simon comes into play. Now, does this mean, the one thing that's unclear here, was there in fact a school of people, honoring and venerating this Simon Magus? There seem to be some indications of that, but it could just simply be a literary trope. The creating this guy as the making him the head of, as if there were people following him, when in fact it's just taking a figure from the New Testament and using that as an emblem for things they don't like and want to criticize. So I'm not so sure about that question, but at least at the literary level, he becomes a convenient way of embodying forbidden practices.
Just an interesting note for our audience. You mentioned earlier that some of these spells or these magicians claim to fly. And here is this funny, humorous thing where Peter and him are fighting and he's flying and he falls to his death.
Yeah.
So
Peter makes you fall down.
So I love getting into this. This really makes me just try to understand maybe how crazy some of the literature that comes later, for example, Jesus being a little infant and turning clay birds into like the impact, especially when more non-Jews are entering the movement, bringing a lot of the baggage, like you're talking about, maybe people who are really trained to be magicians and not Jews. There might be this weird literature that starts to come on the scene that's more magical about Jesus. And so
the infancy gospel of Thomas, for the sake of people who don't know, you got this little Jesus, stories about Jesus from his childhood, because obviously we don't have those stories in the New Testament, and so people made them up. And Jesus does things like, he's playing in the mud and making these like pigeons, and mama comes out and says, "Jesus, you're getting dirty." And so he claps his hands and makes the birds fly away to dispose of the evidence. He gets mad at one of his playmates and curses him, and he dies. And then he raises him back to life again. And so, on and on, stories like this. And I think you're right that, I would not want to attribute that to people trained in Magia. It's just more it's in the atmosphere. It's in the mindset. If this guy was indeed the kind of person we say he was, he must have been able to do these kinds of things even as a child. And so yeah, it's bringing elements of this kind of, maybe we could say, a magical mindset that would see these things as normal, as acceptable. Even the elites, for somebody to reject Magia entirely was rare. Just like to be atheist was rare. Elites thought these things were illegitimate, but they didn't think they were impossible. They just thought they were could be used for wrongful ends. In fact, there's a lot of fear. One thing we haven't talked about, we talk about curses and this kind of thing. A lot of fear in the ancient world of magic being used to harm people. And so while there's not much legal action against Magia, when it does occur, it's against harmful Magia. Whether that may be, whether it involved poisons or whether it involved curses, causing magic that caused harm. And again, everybody believed that magic was out there, could be used to cause harm and cause harm. In fact, Pliny the Elder who's a great resource. Pliny the Elder's Natural History from later first century is a wonderful, wonderful resource for all things magical. He's kind of a compendium of of a lot of this in some of the books in his work. But he talks about everybody is worried about somebody being able to use words to cause damage to them, or trying to gain some power through enchanting words or something like that. So this was it wasn't just a fringe thing. It's something that even among the elites, they believed in all these kinds of things. They just didn't, some of them used it. They didn't actually practice it. There's only a couple of examples that we have from our records of elite people actually trying to become adept at Magia, but they certainly would use their services.
So I have one more question, and it's more like a statement / question. When I interviewed Del C. Allison Jr., we had a hoot. He knows I'm a skeptic, I'm like, I'm very cautious because there's so much of this going on. It's very difficult to know if any of this is real. How do you know between what isn't and stuff? There's a lot of that going on. But this is my question. I asked Del Allison, I said, sir, let's say that the tomb was empty with Jesus, right? And this was his statement. So this is kind of an interesting little discussion we had. And I said, what would be the most probable if you put on your skeptic hat? Like I forced him. He's like, oh, well, if you want me to be a skeptic for a moment, okay. And I said, if you were a skeptic for a moment and you just said, okay, I can't grant that a resurrection happened, what would best explain the data in his terms? And he said, he blew my mind. This is what he said. You're going to be like, what? You might even agree. I don't know. He said that in that time, when someone was a holy man or very powerful person, the corpse was valuable to these magi, these people that would potentially use the dead bodies for incantations or potentially something of the sort. He said that there's something with the dead body of someone who's like a sacred, powerful human being. I don't know. And he said maybe they stole his body and would have used it or maybe used it for some type of ritual or something. He said that would be my best guess. And I guess because of like the Nazareth inscription, he didn't say this, I'm guessing like there's already these people like who are messing with graves. Maybe it's because they're just stilling things out of the graves, but there might be people really stilling corpses. And he thought maybe that would be the best guess, that someone stole the body for something like that. And I personally don't even go that far. I'm like, maybe there's other explanations, but it blew my mind that he said that. What do you think about his thought there?
I'm not familiar with that. I certainly bodily substances, for example, gladiators, all kinds of things associated with gladiators, their sweat, their blood and things like this were used. And so after their death, I guess I'm thinking out loud here. Right. Human body parts were certainly used, but only at the fringe. I mean, there were certain things that were certain forms of magic that involved substances like dung and corpse material that were very fringy, even among Magia performers. So I would certainly not see that as something that was, I don't know, I wouldn't go there. But probably where you wanted to go with that, because something we talked about ahead of time is, what do we make of all these claims? What do we make of all this magical kind of stuff? And it probably depends a lot on the particular instance. One of the things we talked last time about placebo effect and how suggestibility can cause good effects. But one of the things we didn't talk about, have you ever heard of the nocebo effect?
Mm-hmm.
It's the opposite. One of the things I just was reading this morning, that a study of 12 clinical trials of COVID-19 vaccine had found that 76% of the side effects that people claim to have experienced from receiving the vaccine they claim can be attributed to the nocebo effect. And what they mean is when you tell people about side effects that a particular drug can have, some people are inclined to actually develop those side effects. And that can happen just as a placebo. It can have, you can have health benefits even if you give a sugar pill or whatever. It works the other way too. Mm-hmm. If you give somebody a sugar pill and tell them all the possible negative side effects, some people develop those negative side effects.
So my wife right now, our vehicle we just took to the shop a month ago, had to get something fixed, and they rushed it in, got it out, said it's fixed. And my wife is just really cautious going, are you sure? Like, she can't believe it. And then they're like, no, I'm sure. And because another light came on a day later, she brought it back. And now yesterday we had this conversation while driving. Do you feel something's wrong with this vehicle? I feel like something's wrong with this vehicle. And I'm going, honey, there's nothing wrong. I don't feel anything wrong with it. And I even mentioned to her, I think that she does this with medical issues as well, where the kids get sick or whatever. She goes online, Googles, and she'll come back and go, he might die in 3 days. And I'm like, no, you're Googling.
Stop. Now, this is a little different, though. This is actual causality. Or, there's documented examples from anthropologists of contemporary shamans who put curses on people, and they actually get sick and die because of the practice in voodoo of the idea of zombies. I mean, that goes back to an actual practice of using various means to essentially, if you want to look at it as outsiders, to affect a person's mindset so that they lose their power of self-control and come under the power of another. But it's just phenomenal, the kinds of things that people, that our minds can do to our bodies. So some things might be explained that way. Some things are, people actually, they couldn't prove it the way we can today, but they actually hit on actual healing substances or harmful substances and things that they thought of as magic were naturally effective. You could talk some about exorcism and demonic kinds of things, and to what degree is that psychological, and things along those lines. Some of the things, the bigger kind of nature miracle type things, one wonders how much of that is just people puffing themselves in the marketplace. Hey, I can do this. Hey, I can do that. Hey, did you hear? He can do that. He can do that. Boy, all these magicians, they can do all these things, but did anybody ever see them do them?
Right. Yeah, and then you brought up yesterday on our wonderful little conversation on the phone that there's some things we just don't know. And so there's some people who think maybe there's more to it. And whereas with me, I have a presupposition of thinking if we don't have an answer, it's probably because it's not testable or we're not able to get there yet. And I still would think it's probably more probable that there's some explanation that we don't know. While some people, and I get why, approach it thinking, no, I think that those things that we can't test really do have an underlying spirit or a power or something. They may not call it like the ancient world where it's this daemon and that daemon and all this, but maybe they think it's a force, demonic or good, angel or God, whatever their worldview might encompass. They might still think that. And I just draw different conclusions. You know what I mean?
I think you'll find that probably there are very divided opinions on this in academic studies of religion. But if anything, there's been a tendency in the last few decades to move toward more openness in that area. And I'm not talking about believers. I'm just talking about anthropologists or academic scholars, to at least allow for the possibility that could well be something going on here. In other words, to not be so immediately, enlightenment, rationalistic, everything has to have a scientific explanation. And you look at the kinds of things that shamans do or whatever. And, without trying to, obviously, some people are going to privilege their particular brand. And so for Christians, we know these things happen and they're true because we know there's a God who does miracles. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just looking cross-culturally at the kinds of things that go on, and that I think there's more openness in general in contemporary society than there used to be, to say that there's mystery out there, that there are things that science can't explain. That science is good insofar as the kinds of things it can do, but that we need to get away from this kind of mythology that science can explain and answer everything, and that if it doesn't have a rational explanation, it must be fraud or something like that.
Right.
So, so I think that, I will put myself more in the latter camp, without trying to provide the answers. I am also a Christian believer who would have my particular reading of that, but totally apart from that, simply looking at the totality of human existence.
Right.
I find it, when I try to put on my rational glasses and see things entirely through that lens, it just doesn't seem to work. It seems like you got to ignore a lot of mystery and uncertainty and inexplicable kind of stuff, and you still got to ultimately rest on faith, i.e., well, we got to trust that somehow there's a rational explanation, even if we don't know it. Well, that's faith. So you are no longer being a purely rational being.
Yeah, I think obviously where I fall on this. I think that we're discovering how I think anthropology and the constant study of understanding how our minds worked, the way that we thought about these things, they had practical evolutionary use, in fact, too. So there's a lot of where I would say the faith is for me is simply that maybe we'll come to understand how we've come to where we are, and that might allow us to try and fill in these gaps of these mysteries to some degree. I don't think everything will ever be solved or answered. We are primates on an earth that, the universe, as one famous scientist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, said, he goes, the universe does not have to make sense to us. So that I like that. And there was one interesting thing that I wanted to say in light of all this. The most outspoken atheist, Richard Dawkins, even said to James Randi when he had the Randi Foundation, trying to tell all these shamans and these people, these future tellers, everything, if you have power, come here. We'll scientifically test to make sure that this works. If you get it, you win $1 million. And Richard Dawkins went on air on a stage one time and said, you're really risking a lot here and what you're doing. He goes, I don't mind, because I'm confident that these powers, these magics aren't real. And Richard Dawkins says, you don't know if humans have this capability, let's just say. And it's not that what they used to call it might have been magic or a demon or a spirit, but what if we humans have some capability of something naturally, a natural phenomena that we have attributed to divine whatever, just like you talk about placebo nocebo, like there's a power of self-healing or something happens where this guy comes in and he's able to somehow do this, and you can't prove that it wasn't, whatever you think, and you lose the $1 million. And he's like, well, whatever. So even the skeptic who was willing to go down a natural route was like, what if there's something natural that we just don't understand? I don't know.
As a teenager, I had a while where I was really into parapsychology, and it's very much that kind of thing. Psychokinesis and the power of the mind, and all telekinesis and all these kinds of things. And certainly some people have claimed that we have mental powers. In the end, I think we don't know, and I'm not sure we'll ever know. I will challenge you a little bit to say that I think fundamentally you have a faith in the adequacy of human rationality, and that is a faith stance.
Right.
Fundamentally saying that I think that ultimately I trust that somehow, if we knew everything, we could come up with a rational and scientifically valid explanation for everything. And you'll never be able to prove that to be true. You hold that on faith.
Right. I think that the reason I start with that premise is the way I've come to know things when I was dying from heroin addiction was people were telling me it was a spirit. It was you were, when I was a believer, they told me it was a spirit, a demon. The reason you were addicted to heroin had, all of these supernatural or spiritual defect type characteristics. And when I started finding out some science behind the wiring of my brain, genetic connection between my father's addiction as an alcoholic, also the trauma of my upbringing and things like that, I started to look into natural scientific explanations, which fit the data far better for me. And I was able to practically actually apply and recognize some of these things as facts. And when I did that, I realized after reading and researching some of the ancient world, the volcano's eruption was due to a god. Now, I can't prove that the volcano didn't erupt because of a god. They believed that. But what I do know is plate tectonics and shifting crust caused the pressures. I could show why the volcano is erupting in the natural world without having to posit the phenomena of metaphysical things. And for me, as I started to practice that principle, I gained faith in this process. And so when I don't know something, if we had 10 out of 10 things were attributed to the divine or God in the ancient world, and we now can show 8 or 9 out of 10 of those things with natural phenomena being explained and better explained in the data, it does lead me to think. It doesn't mean I know that the answer is this. It leads me in that conclusion to say, this seems more probable than what we once thought, that if you say this word, all this magical power, things like that. You know what I mean? That's all I'm saying.
And you would, of course, already know too that the same is true of religion. Whatever religion want to end, you have to start with a certain basic outlook, basic kind of a faith stance, and then you recognize, you find and validate evidence to support it. And in both, you end up leaving out things that don't fit the model. I mean, in the end, we're all even the most fervent believer. If you whether it's believer in science or believer in religion or whatever, has to ultimately admit, hey, we're all guessing at this stuff.
At the end of the day, literally, this is the question I go to sleep sometimes. Why is there anything rather than nothing? And that question we don't know the answer to. All of us love to play in this thing we call life and figure out what we think we can know. But
ultimately faith is you put your life, where are you going to put your life? And where are you going to make that commitment? Because everyone lives by faith. Every single human being. It's just a question, what are you putting your faith in? And we all have our choices to make in that regard.
Yeah, and for those who are watching, the definition of faith, okay, they'll start to get caught up on this whole particular, what do you mean by faith type thing?
Yeah.
And
I'm not what direction you're committing your life to go in.
That's the simple definition we're trying to use right here, right now. So don't get all caught up in
doesn't have to be religious, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be religious. There are things I walk in my daily life where I'm confident and I hope I have aspirations and hopes. I'm a human like you. Dr. Stanley, I'm telling you, this was an amazing episode. I hope our audience really saw some beauty here at the end, even like how two different people who have different conclusions, literally walk hand in hand and are like, okay, let's explore this crazy, interesting world of humans' minds and how we understand the world and things like that together. This brings so many more questions. It really does. It makes me want to know more about what was going on. I wish we had more evidence just to know more what was maybe going on in Jesus' day and Paul's day, since we only have 7 letters. But I really do appreciate you teaching and educating us on magic. I hope everybody goes and gets the trilogy, or at least some of the books.
Also, refer back to we've had 2 prior conversations that tie into and lead up to this film. One of them is posted on your site already, and the other one, I guess you said, is going to come out soon. So you might want to refer people to those to get the whole picture.
Yeah, go check him out on was Paul okay with people going to the Asclepius temple to be healed? You got to go watch the episode to find out, because this is, and you got to get his books. Look, the whole reason I first had Dr. Stanley on to begin with, right? I didn't know he knew all this stuff. I'm thinking, okay, here we have a Pauline scholar. We're going to deal with pericope. We're going to dive in, and we will. We're going to have fun in the next episode, really get into Paul's teachings and stuff. What's he doing using Hebrew scriptures, all of this fun stuff. But this wasn't why I first started. And then I found out, man, there is some really interesting things that he has brought to attention, and it overlaps a lot of the material we do at MythVision. So please go check out those episodes. Please go get some of his works, and especially the trilogy, because this right now, I mean, the 2 books that he has in his trilogy, You can go ahead and get them on Audible. Go listen, educate yourself in the ancient
Amazon
world.
or Audible, yeah. Or lots of other sites too, yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And for everybody who's wanting to know, that is a slavestory.com.
Right,
And
there we go.
here it is here. 2 of the books are out. Third one will be out when he's done writing it, and he's not done writing it. And that's A Ram from Mars, or...
Right.
I'm looking forward to it. Really excited about that. Everybody go check him out, please. Also, MythVision Patreon. This video will be up early for those who help support us. Just like all the other content, when it's not alive, I usually publish it early and let you all get a sneak peek. You can private message me. You can harass me and tell me how wrong I am. I don't mind. Either way, it doesn't matter. Is there anything you'd like to say before we go, Dr. Stanley?
I think we're done. It's been a lot of fun talking with you. I just really enjoy these sessions. I'm glad we found each other.
Same here. If you're struggling in life, you just don't know the answer, that's okay. I don't think at the end of the day, any of us really know all there is to know about it. And I want those who are skeptics like me to be open-minded in this sense. You don't believe in the supernatural? Got it. That doesn't mean there's not practical application and that experience doesn't play an important role. Don't boil it down to molecules and this and that. Sure, you can maybe say that that might be the cause, but you don't live like that. I don't live every day going, well, that emotional drive I have towards my wife, that was just the chemical compounds in my frontal lobe cortex connecting to the midbrain. Come on. You know, that's cool to know, but living like a human, which means let's put our prejudice to the side and realize that we're all humans and we should love one another and try to empathize and relate as much as we can. And with that being said, we are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.